I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of AgLawToday, and today we're talking about one of my favorite topics that's near and dear to my heart, which is prenuptial agreements. I've got a special guest on the line, Sabra Sasson, coming to us live from Manhattan in New York City. Sabra, why don't you introduce yourself, tell our listeners who you are, and a little bit about your law practice.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thanks so much for having me here. So, as you know, I'm a New York City, Manhattan attorney. And my law firm, we're a holistic law practice, which helps people who are getting married and divorced legally protect themselves, their loved ones, and their assets. And most of the work that we do is we do a lot of prenuptial agreements. We also help people do mediated divorces, collaborative or litigated divorces. And we also pride ourselves in giving a lot of resources to our clients, whatever it is that they need before, during, and after marriage.
So Sabra and I met while I was living in New York. We were introduced from a real estate broker there in Manhattan. She's a fellow family and matrimonial attorney. And Sabra, I'm curious, and I don't think I've ever asked you this question. How did you fall into family and matrimonial law?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's the exact reason why I got into it. So many years ago, it's like 14 years ago, I had gotten married, and unfortunately it just didn't work out. And I was hoping to get through end my marriage on amicable terms with my husband. But unfortunately, we wound up having to do a litigated divorce with no property, no assets, no children. And it was very excruciating, very painful. It felt like it took forever and cost me a fortune. And so after my situation was finished and the dust settled, I realized I wanted to help other people not have to go through what I went through.
Yeah,
So
that's a great story.
Yeah, it was really painful.
So we worked on a book together, and I believe that you wrote the chapter on prenuptial agreements, and you have a book or two of your own. Do you want to say a little bit about that as well?
Sure. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we worked on a fantastic book together, Onward and Upward, a guide for people going through divorce. And one of the chapters that I contributed was about prenuptial agreements. And so I'm really excited to talk about it today. I was one of those people who was not a proponent of prenuptial agreements. And after my own divorce, I'm a huge proponent, and I see how it's really beneficial and useful. And I hope to share that with people today. The other books that I've been a part of, I was part of a collaborative book called Success from the Heart. And it's a collaboration of 35 co-authors who contributed their story. And my chapter is about Dream a Different Dream. And it's about how people can have what they want, when things aren't working out. And so out of my horrible situation of my broken marriage, I was able to turn it into a way to help other people who are going through the same scenario and hopefully not have to live a painful divorce like I did. And I'm currently writing a book that I've been working on for quite some time, and I'm finally going to have it published very, very soon. I'm really, really excited about it. And it's called The Harmonious Divorce, The 4 Steps to Uncoupling. And I can't wait to get that out into the world.
That's a great title, because I feel like divorce does not have to be so acrimonious as like some people want it to be. By the way, Sabra, I'm curious, whenever you're at a cocktail party or you're out and about and people ask you what you do and you talk about prenuptial agreements, if people say to you, well, aren't you just planning for the end? Isn't it taboo to really talk about divorce when you're trying to get married? What's your response to that?
Sure. So it kind of taps into the exact same reasons why I used to be an opponent of prenuptial agreements, and now I'm a huge proponent of it. And the reason that I tell people that it's so important to have a prenuptial agreement, or at least what I call the prenuptial conversation with your partner or soon to be lifetime partner, is because we all avoid talking about those tough subjects. We avoid talking about money. We don't avoid talking about planning for the future. And just like in a business partnership, you really wouldn't go into a business partnership arrangement without having a shareholders or a partnership agreement. And your prenup is kind of like that. It's kind of insurance against divorce. I really see it that way, because if people get more comfortable talking about money, talking about these various issues that are really challenging and uncomfortable, that they have a better way of communicating with each other. Because let's face it, right? Money kind of makes the world go around. You know, you got to pay your rent or mortgage, there are bills to pay. If you have children, they're pretty expensive. And so if you don't talk about the type of life that you can actually afford to live together, then unfortunately you might be in for a rude awakening afterwards.
Yeah, I always tell people nobody gets on the airplane thinking it's going to crash, but you still go over the safety instructions. So I look at prenups often the same way. It's the safety instructions for a marriage, right? So we've talked a lot about prenups. For our listeners who maybe aren't familiar, can you just give a background on what exactly is a prenuptial agreement?
Sure. A prenuptial agreement is a premarital contract. It's an agreement that's sometimes referred to as a prenup. You might have heard that phrase. And it's a written agreement that's entered into between two people before they get married. And it details all of their obligations to one another with regard to their property, whenever it was acquired and wherever it may be situated. I mean, people may be getting married in the United States, but may have property abroad. And it doesn't matter where the property is situated. You still want to have it protected. And you can address that in a prenuptial agreement.
So I just had a prenup consultation this morning. And when clients come into your office and say, what do prenups even discuss? What's your response to that? What are the big issues?
So the major issues is identifying what they're going to define as what is marital property and what is separate property. That's huge. And it's a big part. I know every time I write a prenup or I review a prenup, that's the first provisions that I'm looking at. The other things that we're doing is we're looking at, how do you want the property to be divided in the event that there is a breakup of the marriage, unfortunately? How is that going to happen? Will there be spousal support? What's that going to look like? Other things that they can talk about is whether or not you're currently receiving or paying child support or spousal support because of a prior relationship. So those are the major things. There's other issues that are discussed too, but those are the major ones that I can think of right now.
All right, Sabra, you talked a little bit about how prenups define marital versus separate property. In Illinois, we call it non-marital property. So how do prenups really address this specifically? What are some deviations that you see? And a question that I often get is, how does it differ then from the law?
Those are all great questions. So hopefully I can remember all of them. But essentially, what you're doing with a prenuptial agreement is that the partners are coming together and they're deciding what they deem to be is fair. So the first point is to understand what the law actually says right now, which is anything that you acquire during the marriage is marital property. And so in the event of a breakup, it would be subject to possible equitable distribution. And so if you don't intend for that to happen, then the prenuptial agreement would now define what those things are. So I can give you a couple of examples. So for instance, when people earn a living and they get their paycheck, they normally deposit it into a banking account, and any payment that they receive is now marital. It's earned during the marriage, it's marital. But if they deposit it into an account that either existed before the marriage, or even if it's a new account during the marriage, it's still marital money, even if they put it into an account with only their name on it. And many people will say, well, I don't know if I want my entire salary, my entire income to be considered part of the marital assets. And so in the agreement, we can define what it is that they want to use and what percentage or portion of their income that they want to be attributable to marital property, as one example. Other things that we see are also retirement accounts, 401ks, IRAs. Those tend to be bigger assets that people spend many, many years building and growing and investing in. It's something really important to people, and everyone has different opinions as to whether they want it make it as part of the marital estate or not. And we get into other complications like commingling of funds, which if an account existed before the marriage, in a way it's non-marital or separate property. But if they start depositing and putting more new money into it during the marriage, they now commingle the accounts with marital funds. And now there's a question that's raised as to which portion is non-marital and which portion is marital, or maybe the whole thing is marital. And so these are the things that people tend to fight about in the event of a divorce. And the whole point here is, by doing this agreement, you want to avoid all those fights. You want to avoid all those arguments in the future, so that it's really clear as to what the two of you feel is fair and what's right.
Yeah, and the law, as you know, in New York and Illinois and in most states is equitable distribution, not equal distribution. And so people spend a lot of money fighting in court over what exactly is equitable and fair. And so I think that's why I love prenups so much, is it really sets those clear cut, or we try to be as clear as we can with those rules there. So what do prenups not discuss?
So typically a prenuptial agreement would not discuss children that aren't born yet. So even when people are planning to get married, they may be planning to have a family, but if those kids don't exist at the time that they sign the agreement, you typically can't provide ahead of time, well, you know, if we have a child and if we break up, then you're going to pay XYZ money in terms of child support, or how much money you're going to set aside in your estate for that child. So those are the types of things that we don't typically cover in a prenuptial agreement. There are exceptions, of course. Do you want me to talk about any of that?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So one of the things, there's some case law that is around that essentially says that you can contract other things. You may have heard some interesting cases where people contract for, you know, whether they want their spouse to be wearing makeup, or who takes out the garbage, or you know, there's also case law about religion. So if you're planning on having a child, people may decide, oh, we're going to raise the child in a Catholic religion or Jewish religion, or whatever their faith is. And that typically is upheld because it's something that's a consensus between the parents of what their intention and their plan is. And a lot of people base their decision to get married based upon those questions.
So this morning, my prenup consultation, the potential client is a dentist. And so although he did not have his own dental practice right now, it's very possible that he might have a dental practice in the future. And so one of the questions we need to ask him was, does any future business fit in the marital bucket or the separate property bucket? With agriculture, it's also can be a business as well, right? The farm itself can be a business. What are your thoughts there on how to address business issues in a prenup?
Absolutely. That's a biggie. And I think that's another major reason that people do have prenuptial agreements, whether they have a business today, or like your potential client, they may not have their own business right now, but they might in the future want to have a private practice or a farm. These things are really serious, especially if you may or may not have partners in the future. What typically happens in a business, if you get married and then let's say you predecease your spouse, what happens with all your assets? So if there's no children, typically all your estate will go to your surviving spouse. But now if you have a business, your spouse may know nothing about running your business. Maybe this dentist marries a person who never did dental work. Probably not a great idea for that spouse to become a partner in a dental practice. And so while other arrangements can be made from a business perspective, it would be wise to somehow set up terms, set up insurances and other things that can protect and buy out the spouse. So the spouse is not losing out on the business, but the business is protected because they're serving clients, they're serving the community. And so for the business to continue and not get caught up in a litigation, it would be great to have that addressed in the prenuptial agreements.
So we've talked a lot about the positive things about prenups. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that and then get into any disadvantages that there might be, if any. But what do you see as being like major advantages and disadvantages in going through the prenup process?
Great. I love that question because I'm always talking about it all the time. People are always challenging me in terms of, you know, why would I want to have a prenup? What are you saying, that our marriage isn't going to work out, or you don't trust me? You know, a lot of times people hear that prenups are really just for the rich and the famous. And arguably, I don't know. I think they're for anybody these days, especially now with you have millennials. They're creating businesses right out of the gate, making millions of dollars unexpectedly. You never know what the future is going to be. So the benefits of a prenuptial agreement is financial stability, knowing ahead of time, being clear with your partner, what it is that your plan is. How do you envision what marriage is going to look like? Who's going to be responsible for what? Also understanding what income and assets there are available to the two of you and the type of lifestyle that you can actually have together and build together. Another advantage is if there's any plans or possibility in the future of inheritance, family heirlooms or businesses, farms we were talking about, those are often transferred from family to family, and these things can be addressed in the prenuptial agreement. And again, like you were talking about earlier, that the prenuptial agreement can give a clear line, or as clear a line as possible, with regard to what is marital and what is non-marital. Another benefit is if you have children from a prior relationship, you can make it really clear in the agreement that certain assets are supposed to go to your children, or a certain percentage of your estate you want to go to your children and not to your spouse.
So if a prenup is in conflict with a will or a trust, who wins?
So typically the prenup is signed before the marriage, and then what should happen is that after marriage, people should enter into a will or create a will that is consistent with the prenuptial agreement. So you entered into the marriage with the plan of the prenup, and if it's not consistent with the prenuptial agreement, well, now you have a litigation on your hands in terms of what was intended.
Yeah, a point that I wanted to speak to briefly on what you were talking about is with financial transparency. And this is one of the big things that I love about the prenup process. I mean, I don't know about you, Sabra, but sometimes I'm surprised that people come into my office, they're about ready to get married to somebody in a month, 2 months, 3 months down the road. They have no idea how much the other person makes a year. They have no idea their assets or their liabilities. And so I think that there's something to be said for forcing people to get, quote, financially naked, so to speak, and really talk about those tough issues. Any thoughts there on that?
Yes, I find it amazing and incredible that people choose to get married to one another and they don't know how much their partner's making. They don't know how much assets they have. They don't know what they own or not own, if they have debts, what their credit scores are. To me, I find that really incredible that you're willing to spend the rest of your life with somebody and have no clue as to where their financial standing is. So it's really kind of odd. Yet, however, if people go to buy a home, they're very happy to disclose their finances to a stranger, to the mortgage broker, the real estate agent, so that they can go and buy the home that they can afford. But, to me, you're going to spend the rest of your life with this person. It kind of goes to what type of life you're going to build together. It's great to have that romance. You're in love, all those feelings, emotions, all of that's great. But the reality is marriage isn't just the Hollywood dream of the romance, but it's also a financial arrangement. Mm-hmm. And I know that's hard for people to hear, and a lot of people don't want to hear that, but it becomes really evident, God forbid, the relationship doesn't work out. It becomes all about money, all about the assets, all about the debts. Finger pointing can happen. And with a prenuptial agreement, what I love about it is people are talking about this while they're in love. When they care most about each other, they're more likely to treat each other in fairness and in a loving, warm, wonderful way, not a finger pointing way like, I can't believe you don't have this or that. It's just, this is what we have. This is what we got. This is what could be. Look at how great this is. Look what we've accumulated and worked so hard for. Now when we join forces, what could the future be? And I think it could be quite empowering for people.
Yeah. And also I think it's very loving to say that no matter what happens to our relationship, that I'm going to make sure that you get a fair handshake at the end of this, right? That you're taken care of and you have that security. So what are some of the disadvantages of prenups, if any?
Great. I'm glad that you brought that up. especially with regard to how people are going to take care of one another. I think that's a key point, that another way of people saying to one another, I know we have this or that, and this is how we'll take care of each other in the future, should there be a breakup. Some of the disadvantages is that, the laws can change, circumstances can change. You're entering into these agreements today now with the understanding of whatever the tax law is or whatever the divorce laws that govern in your state are, and you're making the decisions based upon that today. And what can happen is a law is evolving. Maybe it doesn't evolve as quickly as people would like, but whatever changes do happen, it can have an impact upon the agreement that you reach today. And so it also comes with the expectation that there may have to be amendments or revisions to this agreement later on in the marriage. So you may have to revisit this again. So, some people don't really, it's uncomfortable, but this is just part of a fact and reality that unfortunately many marriages don't end. I'm sorry, scratch that. So unfortunately, there are many marriages that end in divorce, and there are many marriages that work out. But the reality is, if you don't face the fact that many marriages end in divorce, then you're trying to ignore reality, and you're trying to ignore the possibility of this and not planning ahead. And this is part of a planning, just like you would enter into a last will and testament in the event that you should pass away. And this is just another arrangement, like I mentioned before, about entering into a business or a partnership. You wouldn't enter into that without a partnership agreement. And you talked about, I think, car insurance earlier. You wouldn't drive a car without car insurance. So why would you get married and not have marriage insurance and have your prenuptial agreement in place?
We were talking before. I don't know the answer to this, but I would love to see the statistics. If people that get prenuptial agreements are more or less likely to get a divorce, sort of my gut reaction from an attorney who's worked with divorces and matrimonial for a long time, I'd almost like to say that they're less likely to get divorced for a few reasons. One, I think it kind of sets forth a solid game plan, but two, it forces some financial maturity, in all of this. So I don't know, Sabra, do you have any thoughts with that?
I would agree with you. And can I share an example?
Sure.
My first comment is, I agree with you. Number one, I would tend to believe that for those marriages that have prenuptial agreements, they're more likely than not to be a successful marriage. And the reason why I say that is because you mentioned the financial maturity. Exactly that point, that these people have taken the effort, taken the time to really talk about these tough issues, share with each other their opinions, their thoughts on money, on debt, what is their credit score, all these things which are really vulnerable and things that people tend to hold to their heart and not share with anybody. And they're like becoming naked, like you said, with one another regarding their financial life. An example that I can share with you, I've had many clients, but one of my favorite stories is the woman that came to me, and she was getting married to a man who earns over $1 million a year. She earned at the time maybe around 50,000, something like that, which is a decent living, but compared to her soon-to-be husband, it was a drop in the bucket, right? So I asked her the question as to whether they were planning on having a family. And she said, oh, of course, absolutely. And of course, I pressed her a little bit more. What is your plans in terms of raising your child? Are you going to stay home, a nanny? There's all different types of ways that people raise children in New York. And she said, of course, I'm going to stay home and I'll raise the child. And I asked if she had had this conversation with her fiance, and she had not. And she was really shocked when she went home to talk to him about it, because in his opinion, he felt that she should still be working. She should still be bringing in a paycheck, even though it was very small compared to what he brought home every month. And through my counseling and advice, she was able to negotiate with him so that she could stay home with each child until they became 5 years old. And I know I'm Facebook friends with her now, and I see that they've had a little boy, and she's super happy, and she gets to stay home with her child. And if she wants to work part-time on the side and do other things, she's able to do that. But without that conversation, I can only imagine what their arguments might have been like if she was pregnant and then told her husband, well, I'm not going to be working anymore. And that might not have been really good for her or the child. So planning this out ahead of time was a great way for them to respect their relationship, but also it was a great way for them to plan ahead for their unborn children. That's what children want. They want to know that their parents got their act together. And these are two people who took the time and the effort to do some planning ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that even if people go through the prenuptial agreement negotiation process and not sign it, I mean, I think that that's a silly way to go about, but they're better off just because it forces them to talk about things that they might not otherwise talk about. So in terms of agriculture, so there's a lot of agriculture producers that are part of multi-generational farm families, farm businesses that these families want the business to maintain generation to generation. How can prenuptial agreements or postnuptial agreements be used to help benefit those farm families to ensure that the business stays in the family?
So that's a great question. It kind of goes to the question we spoke earlier about businesses. An agricultural business operation, farm, is a business, and especially when it's part of the family, it's something that tends to be really important to stay within the family, not have other strangers come into this. So a prenuptial agreement is a great way to protect the family agriculture business and to ensure that it's not subject to equitable distribution. And so it's a way, when you disclose this and talk about it with your soon-to-be life partner, there may be other ways that you can provide for your spouse that doesn't include giving them a piece of the farm or giving them some of, equity in the business. And it also keeps the business out of court and out of being subject to review with their books and records, which is something that not too many businesses want to get involved with, and it gets expensive.
Yeah. I hear you. I just sent off some discovery demands to a farmer and his farm family for some records in the divorce context. So let's talk about farmers that are maybe equity rich, cash poor, maybe have different types of assets like livestock that produce progeny over time. How can prenup sort of address those issues?
So again, kind of similar to defining what is marital and what is non-marital property, is a livestock or is part of the business something that is to be considered in the event of a divorce? Is that an asset if it's acquired during the marriage and now this livestock is capable of, having babies and progeny? Who gets it and what portion? And again, it all goes back to applying the laws of equitable distribution and how far down the line are you going to go with determining that. So a prenup can help clarify those lines so that they're not so blurred anymore, which is what can happen in a divorce situation.
Do you think that when people are on their second or their third marriage that they're more likely to get a prenup than the first time around?
That has definitely been my experience. I think that once someone has been through one divorce, they may have had a bad experience if it wasn't a quote unquote friendly divorce. And certainly by the time if they've had two, oftentimes they know already. They know what they're in for. If they don't plan ahead of time, they realize where all of their time, all their money and paying lawyers to help them sift through all their assets and divide it up. They know where it goes to. So the cost of a prenuptial agreement up front saves them a lot in the back end. So, obviously nobody goes into a marriage expecting it not to work out. But if it doesn't, it's a one-time fee. I've also practiced real estate law. So another example would be when you purchase your home, you also get title insurance. And again, you're not planning on the home burning down or someone else claiming title to your property, but you pay this one-time fee upfront for title insurance, pay it once, and you know that you're protected. God forbid someone down the road claims, you know what, that's my property, and now you got to turn title over to me. So here, you're paying for it once, and God forbid the marriage doesn't work out, then you'll actually use the policy, and you'll apply what it says, and the answer is pretty straightforward. There's not much to fight about, or other than to tell your lawyer, draft up the paperwork in accordance with what we already agreed to here.
Yeah, I've always said people do more due diligence when they buy a house and when they get married. So
That is true.
So let's talk about the enforceability of prenuptial agreements. So sometimes when I'm in a consultation, people will ask me, are prenups even enforceable? Am I just wasting my time? What's your response there with that?
So my response to that is, generally speaking, they're enforceable. It's a contract between two adults that is entered into. It should be following certain protocols for it to be more likely than not that it will be enforced. Like, both parties should be separately represented by counsel. So neither one of them would have the ability to claim duress or fraud, that they weren't informed as to what they're signing. Other things that should be signed before a notary and a witness. And also the full financial disclosure is really important that that's in there. Anything that's not disclosed, you may be risking that asset, that it might not be considered protected if it's not disclosed in the prenuptial agreements. The other part that I was, yes.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, how much before a wedding do you recommend that people sign a prenup? I get that question a lot.
Sure. My favorite is if people would come to me as soon as they're engaged. They say, okay, we're ready, we're getting married a year from now. That would be amazing. But most of the time, people come to me really close to the wedding. Ideally, I would love if they came to me at least 3 months before. And the reason why I say that is because I acknowledge that these are tough conversations. These are really hard issues. And I think that expecting you and your partner to have these conversations weeks before your wedding, there's already so much pressure and excitement, and you just want to get it done because you'd rather be thinking about what color your flowers are and what type of music you're going to play when you walk down the aisle, rather than talking about the subject of a prenuptial agreement. So I like 3 month time frame. I think that's a fair amount of time to get familiar and get comfortable talking about the numbers, talking about, dreaming about what your future will look like, and what the two of you think is fair. When you start getting into 60 days, 30 days, it's really putting a lot of pressure, unnecessary pressure on the two of you, because now you're making decisions that are going to last for the two of you for a lifetime.
Yeah, a good rule of thumb that I heard once was 3 months or before the wedding invitations go out. I thought that was always a good way to look at it there. But I mean, I know that you've probably had people signing prenups a day, 2 days, 3 days before the wedding, and it just makes me so nervous. I can't imagine, being in that position. You're a few days before the wedding and trying to negotiate these major details of an agreement that's going to affect things potentially. So
I couldn't agree with you more.
So Sabra, let's walk me through the process. You have a consultation with somebody. They're like, what is this even about? Walk me through the process.
Sure. So the way that I like to work things is I first like to talk with my prospective client, talk about what it is that they want, what do they envision. I explain some of the basics in terms of what the law is with regard to separate property or non-marital property, marital property. And then I start asking them about what kind of assets they have and asking if they have a business. I kind of have a intake sheet that walks me through and helps me identify, when are they getting married and who is their spouse and prospective spouse, and do they have an attorney? So it's a long intake, probably about 60, sometimes it goes a little bit longer than that, where I'm really getting to know my client. I'm really getting to understand and helping them understand what it is that they have and what it is that they want and what could be done or not be done in a prenuptial agreement. Sometimes I'm not even aware of what a prenuptial agreement can address. And so we're talking a lot about that and figuring out, what can they do to have what they want? Or, unfortunately, we also talk about the what if, the part that you don't want to talk about. What if there's a breakup? If you buy a house, what happens with the house in the breakup? If you invest in stocks and whatnot with one another, what happens with those? If you have already retirement assets or you own property in another country, how is that applied? Is that reachable by your soon-to-be spouse? So there's just a lot of in-depth questions. So that's the initial intake. And then once I understand that, it's between me and the other attorney for the partner to decide who's going to draft up the prenuptial agreement. And so whoever, yes.
Oh, are mediators ever really used in this process?
Great question. So I have heard of people using mediators in the prenuptial agreement process. I have not had the experience of a client actually doing it. It's another professional that needs to be retained and hired by the couple to help them. But it actually may be really useful because these are very difficult conversations to have. And I'm essentially asking my clients to go home and go and talk about these difficult subjects with their partner. And sometimes people just don't have the skills and the tools to know how to move beyond, and they wind up getting stuck in like, well, I think this is right and my partner must be wrong, as opposed to, well, we both have different ideas and concepts of where we're coming from, and a mediator can be really helpful in helping them get to the crux of what they really want, rather than getting stuck in the nitty-gritty that really doesn't need to be resolved right now.
And I know, Sabra, we're both trained mediators. We do a lot of mediation in the family law, matrimonial law context. I think it's interesting that neither one of us has really mediated a prenup before. You think it'd both be in our wheelhouse there. And I feel like it's kind of a tough sell to people when I explain to them that you also need to have your own attorney to review things to help make the prenup enforceable. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Sabra, and sort of making prenup mediation more accessible to people.
I mean, I think it's available. I think it's a matter of just discussing and explaining to people, or having them know that this is available to them, that if they're the kind of people that tend to get stuck on and wanting to be right all the time and not being able to have these conversations together, and maybe they're better off having a third person in the room with them, so to speak, well, literally, who can help them navigate those issues and really get down to the crux of what they both want together, rather than, you want this and it's against me. It's not about that. And I spend a lot of time, like you mentioned, that we're both mediators. You probably do this too, where I'm spending a lot of time helping my client get clear on, even though they're saying one thing, we're getting to what they really want. And they're not always able to come up with the words for it. And I have to help them, find them.
So we were walking through the process, and I interrupted you because I sidetracked on mediation. So we've decided on one person's going to be the drafting attorney, the other person's going to be the reviewing attorney, and then why don't you follow along there with the remainder of the process?
Sure. So after that, it's kind of straightforward, what you would expect. So the attorney that's a drafting attorney drafts a prenuptial agreement. Hopefully they review it with their clients, make sure the client's on board with all the terms and understands what it says, and then it's shared with the other attorney, who then discusses it with their client. They probably will have some changes or some other ideas, maybe some verbiage needs to be changed or additional provisions included, and they'll share that with the other party's attorney, who will discuss it with their client. And usually only find that it needs to go back a couple of times. It's not really long, extensive back and forth. I've had that maybe once or twice where we've gone back, I don't know how many times, but usually it's, once, twice, maybe 3 times. A lot of times it's not even that many. And at that point you have an agreement where it's a contract where it contains all the terms that both parties agree to, that they're both willing to live with. They understand everything that's in the agreement. And then we set up a date for signing the agreements. Some people love to come to the same table and sign all at the same time. And I've had other clients who they want to sign separately. So they'll sign with me, and then the other partner will sign with their attorney, and then it's exchanged. So they have fully executed agreements, and their lawyers will also have fully executed contracts as well.
So how adversarial do you find the process usually?
Usually I find it to be pretty friendly, actually. I've had on occasion some interesting situations where there is a big difference in terms of financial disparity between the partners, where one maybe comes from has a lot of family money, the other one does not. So often there are some provisions that could be kind of onerous, and it's just a matter of negotiation. And sometimes it takes a little bit more effort or coaxing or understanding on both sides' part. But for the most part, these are two people who love each other and they want to get married. So we all find a way to work it out so that the marriage can go through and the families can celebrate and enjoy and dance at their wedding and not have to think about this contract.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like to tell people that maybe about 98% of the time things go very smoothly. And then, every once in a while, there's an adversarial situation, and it's usually because the parties themselves just aren't really on the same page, or they're not clearly communicating their desires to their attorney.
Well, it's that too. And also sometimes, unfortunately, I've found, at least for me, in a couple of instances where there's been a disparity in income, they weren't upfront with their partner about what their intentions were. And so they're kind of being a little bit sneaky through their attorney, making their attorney the bad guy with the way that the language is written. But unfortunately, it comes out. You might as well just come right out and tell your partner how you feel and show them how you're going to take care of them. God forbid things don't work out. There really aren't any secrets. And why would you want there to be? This is a person that you chose to spend the rest of your life with.
Right. So do you think everybody should get a prenup?
I would love everybody to have a prenup because, litigating on the other side and having to fight for what is equitable, like you said, we don't have equal, it's equitable distribution. So it's not necessarily guaranteed that you're going to get 50-50, it could be 60-40 or some other percentage in between. And there's so many variables and it gets very, very expensive. I really think it's a valuable resource and tool to have in place. And like we had discussed earlier, I think that it helps strengthen the relationship between two people that are getting married.
So can people change their mind? Let's say we have a farmer client who signs a prenuptial agreement with him or her, and somewhere during the marriage, they've decided to change their mind, that they want to open up a certain percentage of the farm business or perhaps farm equipment or cattle to put it in the marital estate, so to speak. How easy is it for people to change the terms of a prenuptial agreement after they're married?
Great. So that question comes up all the time, and I kind of hit upon it a little bit earlier, especially if there was a change in the law, right? So here you have a different scenario where one of the parties decided, well, you know what, I want to be a little bit more generous and I want to put more money into the pot, so to speak. So certainly they can amend the prenup, or they can do an addendum to the prenuptial agreements. At that point, the major difference that happens there is that the standard of review by a court, should this go before a judge at some point, is very different. So before they're married, they're just ordinary people entering into a contract and getting married. They will be getting married with the intention to get married, but they're ordinary people negotiating at arm's length with one another, each separately represented by counsel. Now, as a married couple, they have this additional obligation to one another. They have fiduciary responsibility to one another. And at that standard, it's a much higher standard. And a judge is going to look at it and ask, is this fair? Was this done properly? Was there any bad dealing, done at this point? So it's just scrutinized at a different level. And I think that people should be aware of that.
So we've got listeners from coast to coast. So for those who are looking for a family or matrimonial law attorney in their community, what are some tips in finding the right lawyer, and maybe some tips for interviewing during that consultation about prenup specifically?
Fantastic. So I always say one of the best ways to get introductions or find out who to work with is through friends and family. People who have already worked with the lawyer, they can give you firsthand knowledge as what their experience was. And I think that's a really fantastic way to decide and choose on a lawyer. But if you don't have any friends or family, or they're uncomfortable sharing who they used, you can go through the local bar association. There's other websites, like a site called avvo.com. Which also has lawyers, it has ratings. You can also check out attorneys' websites, check to see if they've written books and blog articles and other ways to show that their expertise in the field. So it's really important to find an attorney who specializes in this and not a generalist, because there's so many issues involved. There's tax, there's estate planning, there's real estate, family law. There's a lot of issues that go into a prenuptial agreement, and it's really important to find someone who practices in this area on a regular basis and knows what they're doing.
Yeah, Sabra, I don't know about you, but to me, it is so apparent when I'm dealing with an adversary, an opposing counsel who I believe is a real estate attorney or doesn't hardly practice family and matrimonial law at all. And they got some form, prenup that they're trying to negotiate. Any thoughts there on the warnings of using an attorney who doesn't really focus in this practice area?
I think, I mean, I don't know what more to add. I think it could be devastating. You're going to wind up signing a contract, signing an agreement, spending money, whatever amount it is. It's too much, too little. That's your opinion. But if it's not enforceable, or if it's an agreement that doesn't protect you in the way that you're expecting it to protect you, then it's worth the piece of paper is written on, right? So at the end of the day, you're going to wind up litigating these issues. And to me, the whole point is, and I'm sure you practice the same way, I don't want to put together an agreement for a client of mine that may get shot down later and will be of no use to my clients whatsoever. I want it to be something that both people who are getting married are comfortable with. They can live with it. They believe that they're being generous with one another and treating each other with love and kindness and to the best of their abilities. And so, I think that it would be a disservice to themselves to hire somebody who really doesn't specialize in this area.
Sabra, how can people find you?
So they can find me in New York. I'm in Midtown Manhattan. They also can go to my website, sabralawgroup.com. I'm at Midtown Manhattan, like I said, on 44th and 5th Avenue. And would you like me to share my phone number or?
Yeah, go for it. I just also wanted to know that Sabra's New York office is in the same place as my New York office, so you can meet us both at the same time. Go ahead and give us your email and phone number for our listeners.
Fantastic. So my phone number is 646-472-7971. And my email is Sabra, Sabra, at sassonlaw.net, which is S like Sam, ASSONLAW.net.
Great. Thank you so much, Sabra, for your time.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we are now entering the Ask Carrie part of the podcast, and today's question comes to us from somebody in upstate New York. She writes, what do I do if a non-police officer visits my livestock operation and wants to look around the farm? Well, the law can vary on this from state to state, and one of the biggest pieces of advice that I have for agriculture producers is they need to have a plan before something like this happens. So I really encourage agriculture producers to develop that relationship with an attorney beforehand and talk about these hypotheticals. What do I do considering the law in my state if this happens? In New York, non-police officers, selected non-police officers, are clothed with police authority. We call them peace officers. So specifically in New York, the SPCA is clothed with police authority, not other animal rights organizations, but SPCA. And so the first thing that I advise my clients to do is to ask for identification. Who is this person? And if you are dealing with either a police officer or a peace officer, such as the SPCA, then you need to treat that person as they are a police officer. So ask for identification. Who is this person? Step 2, ask for a warrant. Do they have a court order? Do they have a warrant to be there on the property? If the answer is no, I'm not telling you that you need to tell that person to get off of the property, but depending on your game plan that you've developed with your attorney, you should react accordingly. So ask for that warrant. If they hand you a warrant, then you need to read the warrant. I have had cases come across my desk where the warrant might be to look out for potentially abused dogs that are in the backyard. And if that's the case, then the police officer or the peace officer cannot be going out into the barn and trying to see if the horses and the livestock are, fed and watered properly. So pay attention to what the warrant says and make sure that the peace officer or police officer does not go outside of that scope. Number 3, ask if the visitor has any camera or video equipment, even a smartphone. And if the answer is yes, then don't be afraid to take your own pictures and videos concurrently while the other visitor is on the property. You certainly don't want to have any video that would be used in court or perhaps out on the internet if you don't have your own to sort of test to see if there's been any kind of misrepresentations. And the last piece of advice that I have for clients is to take notes during the farm inspection. Are there some cows that are in heat? Is there a horse that is perhaps thin because there's some kind of an illness that horse is dealing with? What's the body condition of the animals? Has it been a while since they have been fed? What are the conditions at that moment in time? What time of day was it? How many people were present? Where exactly did they go on the property? How long that they were there? So keep copious notes while this is happening. And then when the peace officer or police officer leaves, that's when you need to call your attorney that hopefully you've already developed a relationship with and discuss what just happened. If you have a question that you would like to send to me, please email me at Carrie, C-A-R-I, @rinkerlaw.com, spelled RINCKERLAW.com. Again, that's Carrie at rinkerlaw.com, and I would love to address your question.